Erik, Chapter 29.
Meg, I began, using what I thought was my calmest voice. I need you to pull Gustav back up onto the dock, please. I decided I'd better start with one small request and see how she responded to that. In response, she shook her head without saying anything and pushed Gustav a little further off balance. I felt my panic begin to rise as I wondered how long she could hold the boy's weight suspended over the angry sea before her hand and forearm would have to relax. I took one step toward her, raising my hands placatingly when I saw her tense up. What can I do for you, Meg? How can I help you? What can I give you in return for saving my son? I felt a flush come over my face as I publicly admitted for the first time that he was mine. I looked for a moment at his struggling form. He had not turned to look at me and was continuing to try to make it back up to safety, so I surmised that he had not heard me over the crash of waves below his feet. Meg looked at me silently, with an expression on her face that I could not decipher. Suddenly, we were interrupted by Antoinette's clattering footsteps rushing onto the dock. I turned to look at her and raised an eyebrow. Did she care to take a crack at fixing this situation? As it turned out, she did not. She stood leaning against one of the fence posts that lined the dock, arms folded, apparently entertained by my attempts to convince her daughter not to murder my son. I honestly didn't expect much else after her attitude toward me in the past little while. I turned my back on her unhelpfulness. A sudden outburst brought my attention back to Meg in a hurry.
What can you do for me? I would like some recognition for the fact that your carnival would not be running without me. And I would really like for you to love me the same way you love her, the woman who's never in her life done anything for you.
She gestured angrily at Christine. Her whole body shook with outrage, and one of Gustav's feet came off the dock as he swung off balance. I felt my heart stop until I saw him planted again securely on the edge of the weathered wood. I know I owe you a lot, Meg, I began, but I was interrupted by an indignant deluge of truth.
You don't know what you owe me. When the city council wanted to shut you down because they thought our dances were too scandalous, who went to the mayor and reminded him that women who can show some skin are willing to do other things? When your lawyer was going to charge you more than this place was worth to defend you from some paltry lawsuits, who convinced him to accept payment in kind? Who has welcomed every rich man that has ever walked through our gates and made sure he has had the time of his life here? Those same men that became your investors, you think they invested in this place because you found a good throat-singing act? No, they gave their money so they could have access to me. Likewise, the journalists that wrote all those puff pieces for the paper last year, my doing, every one of them. And I've received nothing except you are about to prevent my mother and I from receiving a single penny for our efforts, in favor of a child. No, monsieur. I did not give up 7 years of my life to lift you to prosperity, to watch you give it all away to someone who made her choice and turned her back on you, confidently and gladly, 10 years ago.
I studied her carefully, still uncertain what I could say to make her pull my boy back from the grim death he was staring at. I felt Christine come to my side, take my hand and cling to it. I tucked her hand under my arm so that I could break free of it more easily if I should suddenly have to lunge forward. Rather to my surprise, it was this show of unity between Christine and I that dissolved Meg's stubborn resistance. She pulled Gustav back and made sure he was steady on his feet at the end of the dock. Then she turned back around to face us. She still had her hand fisted into Gustav's shirt, but he was now standing securely on his own 2 feet on the dock. Tears began to pour down her face.
Every time I lay down for you, I imagined it was you over me. I wanted so badly to marry you, but you never saw me. It is hell to be invisible, monsieur.
I, who had spent my entire life trying to blend into invisibility, was not quite sure about that, but I didn't want to argue with her now. Suddenly, she gave in. She released her hold on Gustav and pushed him toward us. I opened my arms to catch him as he stumbled toward us, but of course, he ran to Christine's arms instead of mine. I made sure both of them were all right as they embraced, exchanging a long look with Christine as we silently shared our relief. The cocking of a pistol came to my ear over the crash of the waves, and I whirled back to the end of the dock. I was appalled to see that Meg had pulled out a pistol and was now aiming it at her own head.
I'm useless,
she moaned, through the tears pouring down her face.
I'm going to finish it. I won't stay here and watch you have the fairy tale romance that I wanted. Just see how long your carnival lasts without my interventions, monsieur.
Antoinette gave a horrified gasp and tried to rush past me to intervene. I caught her by reflex as she rushed past me, throwing her back behind me. I made sure Gustav and Christine were behind me, too. It was me that Meg was angry with, so it had to be me who put myself in front of the gun. I raised my hands defensively and began to inch toward her. Give me the gun, Meg. In response, she only shook her head and tightened her grip on the gun. I'm sorry that you had to do all that for me. If I had known that you were working for me in that manner, I would have put an immediate stop to it. I ask you to believe me on that. She squeezed her eyes shut against the emotional pain of hearing that things could have been different. The gun at her temple wavered a little bit. If you do this, Meg, you will deny me the opportunity to get to know you in the way that you should be known. I was trying to walk a line between getting her to believe that she could have my attention and promising her love that I still didn't feel I could give her. You will deny me the opportunity to make a friend. I never noticed before, but you are a good and loyal friend. I know that you feel used and ugly on the outside, but there's a beauty shining through from beneath the surface. I should know. I've been assured that is where my own beauty lies. I raised a hand to my mask-clad face. There's no shame in having inner beauty. Not everyone gets to be as lovely as Christine. I half turned to look at Christine again. The woman I was so suddenly romantically entwined with. The mother of my son. My partner in music for the rest of our lives. She caught my sentimental gaze, but instead of responding in kind, she snapped her attention back to Meg and her eyes widened. She hastily put Gustav behind herself. I whirled back to Meg to see that she wasn't holding the gun to her own head anymore, but now was pointing it directly at Christine. It seemed my mentioning Christine had been a mistake, only serving to reinforce how much I loved her instead of Meg. Meg brandished the pistol wildly, waving it angrily in Christine's direction. She was nearly frothing at the mouth as she tried to form a coherent response to my attempts to calm her. I didn't wait to hear what she had to say, but took 2 giant steps forward and got my hand on the muzzle of the gun. I struggled to point it down to the ground, up to the sky, even at myself if necessary. Anywhere but at Christine. I was horrified to hear a deafening bang and feel heat flash across my palm as the gun went off. I never knew if the trigger had been pulled accidentally or on purpose. I released the gun and frantically ran my hands over my own body, looking for pain or blood that would indicate I had been shot. I completed my check within seconds, and my shoulders slumped in sudden relief at finding myself whole. But the sound of a body hitting the boards of the dock behind me sent ice shooting down my spine. I whirled to see Gustav standing on the dock, whole and unperforated, staring down at the disarrayed pile of fabric that contained his mother. A piercing scream sounded from behind me as I ran to Christine's side. Meg rushed up to us, suddenly wanting to help.
I didn't mean to. It just went off. What can I do? I'm so sorry.
I ignored her in favor of getting my arms around Christine and supporting her where she lay on the dock. This accomplished, I growled up at Antoinette, "Get her out of here before I kill her." Antoinette grabbed Meg's hand and her hysterical cries receded away from us into the dark. Gustav rushed forward, taking his mother's hand and imploring her to speak to him. He didn't wait for an answer but stood up and yelled out,
Papa, where are you? We need you.
He looked ready to rush off into the dark after the juries, to search the entire carnival for the Vicomte. Christine groaned and gripped Gustav's hand tightly. Relief flared in my heart. Perhaps she had a chance. I didn't want to think about the possibility of losing my Christine, preferring to think only of ways to help her survive.
Gustav.
Christine's voice was trembling, but it seemed strong enough. Perhaps she would get through this after all.
Gustav, there is something you need to know. Your father.
Christine, no! I interrupted her. You promised me. More than the prospect of being officially confirmed as Gustav's father, it was the idea of why she might be about to reveal this that sent me into panic. She was going to tell Gustav that I was his father, because the Vicomte was gone, and Gustav would have no one else after Christine succumbed to... No, I thought. No one's succumbing to anything here. Help will arrive. It must. Christine shifted in my arms with a grimace on her face. She held Gustav's hand more tightly, sent me a pleading look, silently begging for understanding, and confirmed to the boy that I was his father. Shock crossed his face as his entire world shifted around him. Now he was no longer the heir to a French castle, title, and the remains of a fortune. Now he was the offspring of a shameful liaison between his mother and a deformed circus freak. Shock was quickly followed by denial. He screamed this denial to the empty night, then took off running down the dock, trying to get away from this new truth. Christine raised herself off the dock to take off after him, and my heart leapt to see that she felt well enough to do this. She took 3 steps, but then collapsed backward, sending my heart plunging back down to the depths. I got her settled into my arms, then began to delicately search her body for the gunshot wound in the dim light of the lantern. I couldn't find anything. Her chest seemed to be whole. Her legs were just as beautiful as they had been an hour ago in her dressing room. Her head was clearly unaffected, and her arms were moving unhindered. That only left. I moved my hand down to her abdomen and felt her dress soaked with blood. The bullet had entered her body just above her left hip. I pressed down on the wound, desperate to stop the gush of blood, but she moaned in pain. I lifted my hand. The blood continued to ooze, so I took her hand and placed it on the wound, telling her to apply as much pressure as she could stand. "Oh, Christine," I moaned. "I'm so sorry. I should have gotten my hand on the gun earlier, and then maybe this wouldn't have happened. I waited for you for 10 years, and the very night I get you back, this happens." I gathered her into my arms more tightly, as if I could keep her alive with the sheer force of my embrace. My mind circled around and around that other occasion, when I had pressed a dying, blood-soaked woman into my arms, a woman who was dying because of my actions. I lowered my face into her hair as the tears started to flow. "Christine," I managed through my sniffles, "being with you has been the greatest joy of my life. Seeing you climb to stardom because of what I taught you was so satisfying, and the way you can always see me under this twisted flesh has always given me hope. And the child that you've given me, My God. I paused, struck by a fresh horror. What am I supposed to do with a child? A child that can't stand the sight of me? Oh, Christine. I squeezed my eyes shut as I tried desperately to memorize the feel of her in my arms.
Just be there for him,
Came Christine's weakened voice.
He'll need someone to talk to about all this. You'll need to get in contact with Raoul. The letter said he'll be at our summer place in Switzerland. Raoul, or at least his lawyers, will ensure that all Gustav's schooling and things are properly dealt with. And then just enjoy your time with him. He can be demanding, but most of the time he is perfectly sweet, just like his father.
I will try, I promised her. I'll give him everything I have. When Sarah died and took my child with her, I thought that all my hopes for a line had died with them. I won't let this second chance go unfulfilled, I promise you. Christine sighed in relief and closed her eyes. I shook her urgently, afraid that my promise had caused her to cede the battle for her life. She opened her eyes once more, and I looked deep into them. The pain seemed to be gone from her face, and she was serene and calm. I could not help but think that perhaps she was recovering, although a glance at the oozing hole in her belly from which her hand had slipped made me question this assumption. She wrapped an arm around my neck and pulled me closer to her.
These past 10 years, even when I thought you were dead, I still loved you. It will be the same with me. I am certain that I will continue to know that you love me, wherever I go from here. Don't cry, Erik. Give me one last kiss instead.
I wasted precious seconds contemplating the idea of a last kiss. Was there ever a sadder phrase? I didn't know if I could go through with her request. I looked down at her face, prepared to again deny the fact of her approaching death, prepared to make the both of us wait until help arrived. One look at her eyes, however, showed me the light fading from them at a steady pace. So I abandoned my fears, scooped her closer to me, and pressed my lips over her. I don't know how long I sat there on the dock, rocking her back and forth in my arms as I tried to get closer to her. I think I was trying to imbue her with my own life force, trying to push vitality into her shattered frame. Our combined breathing was ragged in my ears, mine because of emotion, hers because she could no longer get enough breath. I still had my lips pressed to hers when her last breath came and went, with none following after. Her hand, which had been cradling my head, relaxed and fell to her side. I broke the kiss then, and looked down at her to see her skin turning rapidly pale as her heart stopped. I felt frantically for a pulse in her neck as I had seen medical men do, then gave it up, cursing my lack of expertise. I screamed my denial to the empty night around me, and sat clutching her close to me, rocking her unresponsive body back and forth as I wept hysterically. I could not believe that this woman, who had been so breathtakingly alive just an hour before, was now dead in my arms. Eventually I calmed somewhat, enough to consider what might happen next. I laid her carefully on the dock, straightening her skirt and her hair around her. I picked up her hands to cross them on her chest. The glimmer of Raoul's engagement ring and wedding band caught my eye from her left hand. Even though I felt numb, I still decided I could not let them stay there. The man had let her down in her marriage, then ultimately abandoned her after all. Better she should go to the grave wearing my ring. I twisted the bands from her hand and replaced them with my onyx ring. I replaced the hand neatly on her chest. I stood then, intending to throw the other bands into the sea, and possibly myself after them. But clattering footsteps on the end of the dock caught my attention, and I turned to see Gustav rushing back to the scene, towing Raoul behind him. Against all the odds, he had successfully tracked the man he had called father all his life, through the noise and confusion of the carnival. The two of them stopped at Christine's body, looking down at her. Gustav dropped to his knees and hugged her around the waist, as had been his habit when she was alive. Ra likewise dropped to his knees and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then the two of them clung to each other like the sole survivors of a shipwreck. I turned back toward them, the wedding bands still in my hand. Some instinctive viciousness made me want to throw them at Raoul instead of into the sea, so that he could finally see how badly he had failed her. But this idea soon died as I took in the bereavement on his face. Perhaps he really had loved her, even though he had been unable to give her the music that I did. I considered for a long moment, then extended my hand with the bands in it to him, dropping them into his open palm. I then turned back to the end of the dock. I hadn't quite given up on the idea of throwing myself into the sea yet. I stood there for what felt like hours, contemplating a future laden with the guilt of the death of the third woman I had loved. I sagged against the railing as I considered it. It was too much for any man to bear, I decided. Gustav had someone to take care of him still. I would not force him to live with a man he could not tolerate. I don't even know what I was thinking, only that time seemed to stretch out forever. Both the moment I was trapped in and the future felt interminable. My dismal reverie was broken by Gustav's touch. He picked up my hand where it dangled loose by my side, looked up at me with his tear-stained face, and then wrapped his arms around my waist in a hug that was as much comforting as it was comfort-seeking. I bowed my head as I hugged my son back for the first time.